In this video, I'm gonna be exposing 3 composition tips that pros will never tell you that we use every time in the field that are guaranteed to help you take better photos, all that coming up. Now, why is composition so important? It's the #1 way that you can make your photos better without investing in other pieces of gear. And if you get better at composition, you're guaranteed to get photo results. In the simplest terms, composition is just how you arrange the things in your photo to make it visually pleasing to the viewer. And there are definitely different things that you can do to make it more visually appealing. Now, when it comes to composition, we've all heard about rule of thirds, leading lines, things like that. And if you haven't, here's a composition playlist that's really gonna help you out to learn those things. But these are 3 tips that pros really aren't going to tell you, and they're actually not that hard to do at all. Now, the first tip is all about subject placement, and we all know about rule of thirds, but this one is push your subject just slightly inward on the rule of thirds to make it center just a little bit more. Why is this? Well, if we look at this photo, the subject is on the rule of thirds vaguely, but then if you put the golden mean over top of that, you'll see that it doesn't exactly line up. If you get your subject somewhere in the middle of those, you have a really visually pleasing photo. Now, what is the golden mean exactly? It's based off of Fibonacci's ratio. That is a mathematical equation that the brain sees as the most pleasing placement of your subject in artwork. Now, that's a lot of math, and when it comes to photography, I tend to avoid math at all possible. So the easiest definition of how you can improve your subject placements is just finding a good wiggle room between the golden mean and the rule of thirds. The easiest way to think about it is look at the rule of thirds, look at where the grid lines intersect, and then push your subject just slightly towards the center of the photo, and you're gonna get a good placement of your subject. It's visually more pleasing than the rule of thirds because it's more geared towards that golden mean. But in this situation, you're pleasing both the golden mean and the rule of thirds, and you're getting better subject placement as well. Now, if you have trouble visualizing the rule of thirds grid and you want some help with that, you can hit the display button on your camera to get the rule of thirds grid line on that live LCD screen or in your viewfinder so you can see where the rule of thirds is and place that subject properly in your photo. Tip number 2 is directing your viewer exactly where you want them to look. And that's basically what composition is. Where do you want your viewer to see in the photo, and where do you want them not to see? So the way we do that is to work with our exposure, but doing it in a way with your composition. And there are 2 steps of doing this that I'm gonna take you through. So the first step is you actually do use exposure and composition with your camera settings all in one. The brightest part of the photo is where the eye is going to be looking towards. So you want that to be slightly pushed to the right of the histogram to get into your highlights and your whites a little bit more, or your midtones, and everything else should be just slightly darker. Now, when you're doing this in the field, it can be a little bit difficult, but always make mental notes when you're in the field to say, okay, in post-processing later, I'm going to adjust this part of the photo to be slightly brighter. If we look at like a wildlife photo, we can easily see there's the subject and it's the brightest part of the photo. But what I'm going to do in post-processing is actually edit this to make it even brighter and make everything else even darker. You can do this with a radial mask and making that inside of the mask a little bit brighter, and then inverting that same mask and making everything on the outside just slightly darker. This is a really easy way of doing this and directing your viewer's eyes exactly where you want them to be using both your composition and your camera settings plus post-processing all in one to make a great photo. Tip number 3 is using leading lines the right way. Now, we all like leading lines, and when you think of leading lines, you may think of a photo like this with a huge wide-angle view and a lot of lines coming in from the bottom of the photo. But you can actually use leading lines all over the photo. You can have them coming in on the side, you can have trees overhanging top of the photo to direct you in from the top of the frame. There's so many ways to use leading lines, but the most important thing that you need to do is direct your viewer exactly where they should be looking. Leading lines aren't the subject of the photo, they're actually the complementary subject because they're showing you exactly where to look, because they're basically like arrows in the photo. Now, if you want more help with leading lines, I have a free ebook down below that you can find in the video description and in the pinned comment called Foolproof Foregrounds that guaranteed to up your level of success with your foregrounds in your photography. But when you're learning foregrounds, it's really tempting to put foregrounds into every single photo. I think the ultimate hack is when to know not to use foregrounds because they don't always point you exactly where you want to look. And sometimes they're a little bit vague, like roots on the ground might not point exactly where you want them to, or they might not structure to create a very distinct line on the ground. So when you're using leading lines, the number one tip is to point your subject directly where you want them to look, but also have discretion to not put leading lines into every single photo that you take. These 3 tips are really guaranteed to help you take better photos. If you want more videos to help you take better photos, click or tap this playlist showing up on your screen right now.